While I was spending the last 2 months of my life up to my elbows in ancient Egyptian history for my video on the pyramids, I began to realize just how daunting the amount of archaeological finds exist in Egypt. There are millions of animal mummies alone. The top 50 museums of ancient Egyptian antiquities alone house over 907,000 ancient Egyptian artifacts. And there are at least 48 additional museums housing significant collections as well. Egyptians were meticulous record keepers. In just one section of one precinct of one temple complex in one of the many cities that date back to ancient Egypt, archaeologists have discovered 900 ancient Egyptian statues. There are hieroglyphics everywhere, riddling the walls from floor to ceiling on ancient temples far and wide. There are thousands of homes, tombs, temples, palaces. We have papyri, records dating back 4,500 years. We have genealogies, hundreds of diplomatic correspondences, stelae, paintings, bones, tools, and so much more. And what's more, the dry desert has preserved all of this. Yet there's not one single mention of Israeli slaves, plagues, Moses, Joseph, or the Exodus. So according to scripture, the Jews were in Egypt for hundreds of years but left no signs or traces of their existence? No mass graves or bones with Israeli DNA? No carvings or written records of them? Nothing? And this doesn't just go for Egypt. No matter which way they went, the entire trek from Egypt to the land of Canaan yields absolutely no sign of a massive Jewish immigration where hundreds of thousands of them died over the course of 40 years. We would expect to find something, anything. Literally the kind of evidence that Bible scholars put forth for the Exodus story is things like, the Bible mentions Egyptians having copper mirrors, and sure enough we found copper mirrors. That's about as dumb as saying that we know God parted the Red Sea and violated the laws of physics because the Bible mentioned swords, and Egyptians had swords. Thanks, Einstein, but I think you've been smoking a bit too much of that burning bush.
Thank the Lord for that burning bush.
But here's the thing, there were trade routes connecting Egypt with the entire ancient world at the time, and we know that Egypt imported a significant amount of copper from the Timna mines in Israel. The Bible's authors wouldn't have ever even had to have lived in Egypt to easily be familiar with one of Israel's leading exports. After searching in Egypt for years for signs of a Jewish slave population, both Jewish and Egyptian archaeologists concluded that there wasn't a shred of evidence to this story. These are the experts that are saying this. Christians and Jews sometimes respond to this lack of evidence along the desert trek by saying that sand has covered up all of the evidence. Okay, but that's not evidence, that's just an excuse for why they haven't found anything. But it gets worse than that. I'm here in Israel standing in front of the Ramses Gate, a remnant of an ancient fortress that dates back over 3,000 years. The land of Canaan was conquered by the Egyptian Empire in 1457 BCE, and they ruled over it for the next 350 years. During the Egyptian New Kingdom, the Egyptian Empire stretched all the way to what's modern-day Turkey, and it included all of the land of Canaan, which is modern-day Israel. This time frame thoroughly covers the time that biblical historians claim that the Exodus happened. If the Jewish people actually fled from Egypt during the Exodus, why on earth would they flee from Egypt into other Egypt? They'd literally be fleeing from Egypt to more Egypt. This fortress isn't the only evidence of Egypt's control over the land of Canaan. We have Egyptian stelae bragging about Egypt's conquest of the land of Canaan. Prior to Thutmose III's conquest of Canaan at Megiddo, Egypt was conquered by the Hyksos people. But they pushed off the Hyksos and expanded their empire all the way to modern Turkey. And we know this empire lasted for hundreds of years. Almost 200 years after Megiddo, we know that Ramses II fought to preserve Egyptian control over Canaan at the Battle of Kadesh, fighting back the Hittites. He recorded elaborate details of this military campaign on 4 different temple walls, and the story is also written and preserved on papyri. In addition to that, to this day we have 2 copies of the peace treaty that resulted from this military campaign between the Egyptians and the Hittites in both cuneiform and hieroglyphics in both Egypt and Turkey. And we have at least 369 diplomatic correspondences from this time period between Egypt and the surrounding nations. Many of them were kings in what's modern-day Israel, Lebanon, and Syria who were established as Egypt's vassals. It's very clear in reading their correspondences that they were subjects of the Egyptian crown. Heck, we have 66 correspondences with Ribhada, the king of Byblos alone, which is modern-day Lebanon, and he was a subject of the Pharaoh. We have even more letters from the kings of Jerusalem, Tyre, Amuru, Mitanni, Damascus, Akko, Megiddo, and Gezer, all located in modern-day Israel, Lebanon, and Syria. They grovel before the Pharaoh, ask for interventions, assistance, etc., because they're all subjects of the Pharaoh. When King Thutmose III made the trek from Egypt to Israel with a gigantic army, he did it in just 9 days. If the number of Jews fleeing Egypt was as big as the Bible claims, they could literally form a line 5 to 8 people across, and by the time the first of the group were arriving in the promised land, the rest of the party would still be leaving Egypt. And yet you mean to tell me that they wandered in this tiny, minuscule region for 40 years? No matter how you stretch it, it's shorter than the length of Arizona. One rabbi even says that 3 million Jews were at Sinai and claims that that's only 20% of the Jewish population at the time, and according to the Talmud, 80% of them stayed behind in Egypt. So 12 million Jews stayed in Egypt even longer and still left no trace of their existence? That makes about as much sense as high-definition censored hentai. You can argue that the reason that there's no evidence of Jews in Egypt is that the pharaohs tried to wipe out all history of them, but they tried that in other instances and failed. First, Akhenaten tried to institute monotheism in Egypt by wiping out all records of the rival god Amun, and yet we still have records of this imaginary god thousands of years later. And Thutmose III tried to erase all memory of his mom. That must have been a happy relationship. Destroying her face from monuments in an action that the Romans would later refer to as damnatio memoriae. And that failed too. We still know a fair amount about his mom, including the fact that he tried to wipe her memory from history. So if they couldn't pull this off with individuals and fake gods, how on earth do you expect people to believe that Egypt was able to completely and successfully cover up all traces, tools, bones, and mentions of a population of between 3 and 15 million Jews? Furthermore, we don't even know who wrote the first 5 books of the Bible. Some Christians and Jews thought that it was Moses, and God delivered to him the history of mankind on Mount Sinai.
The Lord Jehovah has given unto you these 10 commandments.
Sure, it's a cool story and all, Rumple Foreskin descending from the mountain after chatting up God, but there isn't a shred of truth to it. Every account about Moses is written in the third person. Numbers 12:3 says, "Now Moses was a very humble man, more humble than anyone else on the face of the earth." Is that really something a humble person would write about themselves? And Deuteronomy records Moses' death. If he wrote the book, how'd he jot that down? Most scholars believe that the Pentateuch, or the first 5 books of the Bible, were written around the 6th century BCE. That would have been hundreds and hundreds of years after the death of Moses, if he existed at all and wasn't pure myth. Lastly, Genesis 14 talks about the town of Dan, but according to the book of Judges, the name of the town at the time was Laish and wasn't changed to Dan until more than 300 years after Moses' death. So whoever wrote the book is referring to the town by its new, more modern name. It's pretty obvious that Moses didn't write the Pentateuch. So if it wasn't Moses, why are people dedicating their lives to follow a book with no evidence, with evidence against it, that's written by anonymous authors? This is madness!
This is
the Bible.
The Jews were never slaves in Egypt. Like the rest of the Bible, it's a mix of myth and legend. And it's about time that we start embracing reality. Whew, that was a lot. How was I able to condense all of that down like that? Well, this video and my video on the pyramids took about 2 months of research, a trip to Israel, and weeks of editing, including 4 consecutive all-nighters and multiple 16-hour workdays. Without a team of editors and researchers, that's enough to burn just about anyone out. Not me. But it gets worse though. If this video gets between 10 and 15,000 views like my video on the pyramids did, it's unlikely that it will even break $100 in ads from YouTube. Now, I've never been in this for the money, and I firmly believe that videos like this are an extremely important resource, especially when we're facing mountains of misinformation, pseudoscience, and religious dogma left and right, day in and day out. I've been doing this for 3 years and I've released over 125 videos like this promoting science and critical thinking. And the only way that I've been able to do this is because of your generosity supporting my work. I appreciate that. About once a year, I'll ask for support like this and I'll get a decent bump in patrons, which helps cover expenses so that I can keep making these videos. And then it slowly trickles back down with either people's credit cards expiring or people unpledging for whatever financial reasons. So this time I'm changing my goals on Patreon. If you want to help this channel succeed, I'm setting my first goal as the basics that we need just to break even. That's a basic salary as well as all of my business expenses. Things like my video editing suite, the subscription-based animation software tool that I use, royalty-free video footage, and everything else that goes into this. But why stop there? See, I want to step it up a notch. If you want my channel to succeed and actually be able to compete with the misinformation of channels like PragerU, then we have to do more, and we can do more. So I'm setting up additional goals to hire assistants, get a team of researchers and editors, rent a dedicated studio building, have an advertising budget to increase our reach, and so much more. The number one hurdle that I've faced the last 3 years has been funding. And you can help with that, even if it's just a couple bucks a video. Please go to patreon.com/holykoolaid and pitch in what you can. Thank you. And thank you so much to everyone who's supported my work so far. You guys rock. And as always,
dare to be curious.
But don't drink the Kool-Aid.